All right, so welcome back to another Bible class here. And today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 14 and 15, not looking at the whole thing. And if you guys didn't notice, I did put a new assignment up on Google Classroom. So make sure you guys check that out. It covers what we talked about last time, the time before, and what we're talking about this time. Okay, so just some questions about Jesus and parables and Jesus and miracles is what we're going to be talking about. We're focusing on today. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 14 and 15. We're not going to touch everything in those chapters, but we're just going to focus on a few things and then talk about those. All right, so welcome everybody. Hopefully you guys all doing well. I know there's some people that have some issues with regard to actually being able to view this because they're in other countries that have issues with YouTube. So hopefully that works out with you guys. And if not, I don't know what to say, but hopefully everything works out. Let me just go ahead and open us up in prayer. And if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to just ask in the comment section in the chat. And let's get started. Dear God, we just thank you for this lovely day that you've given us, another day to live, and we pray that you would forgive us of all of our sins, forgive us of our lack of love for others, our lack of empathy, our pride, and we just pray that you would have compassion on and all of us who are sick, that you would heal them, and you would bring an end to this coronavirus. We also pray for all those who are out of work and are struggling with money, that you would provide for them. And we just pray that you would be an ever-present help during these times of trouble. Pray also that you would help us to understand who you are and to understand your truth as we read the Bible together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so today, let's see, we are looking at Matthew chapter 14. And we are going to skip the story of John the Baptist and then just head over here to verse 13. So remember last time we talked about the parable of the sower, and we talked about a couple other parables about the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of heaven. Several other very small parables about the kingdom of heaven. And you guys got a few questions about that in your homework. Let's go ahead and just jump down. So there's a little story about John the Baptist, which I don't really want to focus on today. I just want to look at Jesus and what he's doing. And so we're going to look at starting verse 13, okay? So if you have your Bibles, I've got the NIV, and if you have yours, you're welcome to follow along. If not, you can just read along with me. Here we are. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew. So basically what happened, so John the Baptist was beheaded. He was executed by King Herod at that time. And so after that, Jesus, that was, John the Baptist was, it was his, I believe his cousin. And so, and I'm sure he's pretty upset about that because Jesus liked John the Baptist, right? So when he heard about that, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So at this point in time, Jesus is already pretty popular, right? So, and that's why you've got the Pharisees who are jealous of him, and so the crowds are following him. They're following him because of his teaching that has authority, and they're following him because of the miracles that they're hearing about. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, apparently they got there before he did, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Pretty reasonable. That's probably what Jesus did most of the time. But it's getting late, so the disciples are like, "Hey, come on, let's do this, Jesus. Let's call it a day. No more teaching." Then Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." I can imagine Jesus probably having a little bit of fun with this. He's, probably just, kind of just wondering what in the world these disciples can actually say after he tells them to take care of them and give them something to eat. So we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So that's not nearly enough to feed more than a couple people, right? They answered, "Bring them here to me," he said. He directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So we don't know the exact number, but it could be very, very large if these people were walking around in families, and it was at least 5,000 people. Most likely, could be in excess of 10,000 people. So a lot of people, and Jesus is able to feed them with only a little tiny one-person lunch, essentially. And so when you think of this, and these people all did this, or these people all ate of it, and they saw this was an example of a miracle. And before we go on any further, let's just talk about miracles in general, right? Miracles in general. And I know we've talked about it before, but let's even just do that. All right. There's a number of different ways that we could maybe define, what a miracle is. A miracle is just something, in essence, you could just define it as something amazing, right? Sometimes people can use the word miracle in quite a light way and just say, oh man, it would be a miracle if I passed this class. But in reality, it's not even that amazing that somebody passes a class, right? Or they might say, oh man, I got healed from this disease. It's a miracle. And maybe the doctors had a part of that too. So a miracle doesn't necessarily have to do with something being impossible. Okay, but clearly, as we're talking about a miracle here, and we're talking about miracles with Jesus, we're looking at things that appear to be impossible. All right, so when Jesus did this miracle, it's something that by human standards is impossible. And not, like I said, not all miracles are going to be like that. But when we're talking about the miracles of Jesus, essentially they are. All miracles by Jesus do fit into this category. By human standards, it's something that's impossible. Something that's impossible for a variety of reasons. And these miracles can be, let's say, healing, which Jesus does. Probably the number one type of miracle that Jesus does is healing. And in this case, Jesus is doing something incredible by multiplying food. So this is some kind of just physical impossibility of getting more food than he had from nothing, right? But not from nothing, it's more of a multiplication of what he did. And nobody really understands exactly how this happened, and whether we understand or not has nothing to do with whether a miracle took place or not, all right? So we have, healing, miraculous, like feeding, multiplying, matter, right? We have a control of weather, right? There's a lot of different times, or a couple of different times in the Bible where Jesus controls the weather or stops a storm or something like that. We have things like people, healing or resurrection. We have, or let's say demons being cast out. And that whole last one with demons being cast out, it's kind of hard for us to really make sense of exactly what that means in terms of today's stuff, but we'll just put that under the whole healing category. And so Jesus has done a whole lot of different healings, control of weather, and we're going to talk about one other special miracle that he does today that's similar to this whole control of weather here thing. But these miracles are things that would be impossible by human standards, and we may even venture to say that these things are, let's say, impossible according to science. So you might think, well, what does that mean then? If these miracles are something that's impossible in science, what do I mean? So I can't take a piece of bread or a loaf of bread and then use that, multiply it to give everybody food, like 10,000, 15,000 people food, and have everybody full, right? You can't, it's impossible to do that. You can't do that. You can't feed that many people with that little tiny bit of food. So what's going on here? What do I mean by impossible by scientific laws? Does that mean that are these miracles like non-scientific? Is that what this means? And I want to talk about that briefly here. Okay, are these miracles non-scientific? And let me just give you the short answer of that is no. Okay, these miracles or any miracles per se are not by definition non-scientific. Well, why is that? What's going on here? We just said that what Jesus is doing with these multiplication of food is somehow impossible by scientific laws. And so how are these not non-scientific? I know it's a double negative, but how is this not non-scientific if it's impossible by scientific laws? Well, let's think about what scientific laws really are and what this means. So impossible by scientific laws, we're thinking that a scientific law is a way to describe, often mathematically, preferably mathematically, but not always, a way to describe what normally happens. That is what science does. Science is looking for patterns. It's looking for how does matter interact? How does matter behave? How does energy interact and behave? And how do these different things occur in nature? What is normal? What normally happens, right? I know it's kind of a strange way to understand what a scientific law is, but a scientific law is a way to describe what normally happens. And it's a way that is based on our observations, right? Let's bring this over here. So it's based on observations and it's based on repetition of what normally happens. Now, it doesn't tell you, so a scientific law isn't some sort of law that says, okay, matter, you cannot do this, and then the matter always has to obey. That's not at all what a scientific law is. A scientific law is a way to describe the way matter behaves. It's not some sort of law that has been imposed upon matter. It's a way to describe the way matter behaves. Okay? And so I think we need to really, really understand that distinction. Okay? And so because a scientific law is describing what normally happens, if this scientific law is broken, that doesn't necessarily mean, well, first of all, it doesn't, just because there is a scientific law doesn't mean it's impossible to be broken. Okay? Because science is merely a description of what normally happens. It doesn't tell you what has to happen. Okay? So far, science has never been able to be predictive. Now, I know people have worked on, let's say, a theory of everything and tried to, let's say, use this as predictive. But science has not been able to be used to predict the future. We can say, yes, if I take some object and lift it up and then let go of it, it will fall. Right? If I take some object, let go of it, it will fall. That's what normally happens, right? And we know that's based on the law of gravity, and we can quantify that. We can measure the amount of gravity. We can measure the acceleration of the object. We can talk about all those different scientific aspects. But that's not to say that it would be absolutely impossible for this thing to just not fall, okay? It would be a miracle if it didn't fall, right? But it wouldn't be absolutely impossible in terms of saying that that could never happen, right? So when we talk about Jesus' miracles and we say, okay, that's impossible according to the scientific laws, it doesn't mean that those miracles didn't happen, okay? Because we have to remember that these miracles are simply and merely a way to describe what normally happens. And so what happens if these are broken, okay? So if these laws are broken, then that would be some kind of, let's say, miracle, or it could lead to a modification of the scientific laws. But the scientific laws are not something imposed on nature, but just a description of nature. Okay? So, a description of nature can be broken and still be okay scientifically. Scientifically. And that means this can either lead to one of two things. Okay? That could mean maybe the law is incorrect, or something special happened. And something special, essentially we're talking about a miracle or any kind of action through an intelligent agent. Okay, and so an intelligent agent such as a human or a god or something else could, let's say, act somehow to cause this to not happen, okay? And so, or perhaps if you observe something to break a law of science, perhaps that means the law is incorrect or there's some kind of exception to the law. But we're not really concerned about this today. We're concerned more about this today, right? And so in reality, well, how do we know whether Jesus's miracles are true or not? How do we know whether they're not just made up by someone or whether they're, true? So that's the question of whether a miracle happened or not has literally nothing to do with science. It's not a scientific question, right? The question of whether a miracle took place, did a miracle happen or not, right? That is a question for history. It's not a question for science. Because science is only concerned about what normally happens and what we can observe and what we can test and what we can repeat. You can't test whether, if I take some bread, if I can multiply it or not. All right? That's not a test, okay? Because a miracle by definition is a special occurrence. It's not a normal occurrence. It's a special occurrence, okay? And so a historical question, this is the way how we can deal with special situations. Right? Science doesn't deal with these special things, okay? And it's not at all, it's a complete misunderstanding of what science is to say, oh wait, science says miracles are impossible. No, that's just merely the definition of what a miracle is. A miracle is something that appears to be scientifically impossible, even though it may certainly have happened. So the question is not, can a miracle happen? The real question is, did a miracle happen? Okay? Because a miracle is a special thing. So did a miracle happen or not? No, that's a completely different question, and this is a valid question. And so how can you even go about answering that? Right? You go about, rather than looking at, well, can we use science to somehow explain it? No, we're not worried about explaining exactly how this happened. Instead, what we're looking at is, things like eyewitnesses. Things like, how are historians recording it, right? And so eyewitnesses or other kinds of recording, right? records. Things like if there's any kind of other somehow artifacts. Now that's going to be very difficult in the case of a miracle oftentimes, but sometimes you can look at things in terms of artifacts if you have some kind of artifact to do it. And not just the eyewitnesses, but also how do people react? Okay, this is very important in terms of how they react, right? So are people reacting as though this is kind of sketchy and this is kind of, well, maybe this really didn't happen? Or are they reacting in a way that is consistent with the miracle, all right? And also how, and very, very important, how reliable are our sources? Okay, so you have some eyewitnesses. You have somebody that records that miracle. Well, how reliable is that? And the more reliable it is, the more likely that this is happening. And the more this person intended it to be interpreted as a historical document, the more, support there is for this miracle. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's going to be pretty hard for you to prove or disprove something that has eyewitnesses. Okay, so you can have support for something, but you can't necessarily prove, okay, this happened or this didn't happen, right? You have evidence for it happening, or you don't have evidence for it happening, one or the other. But it's going to be a historical question and not a question of science, right? Because by definition, a miracle could not possibly is not possibly a normal occurrence. A miracle is a special occurrence, and so it's got to somehow look special in terms of science. All right, so when we look at this, we say, okay, well, what did Jesus do? Did he actually feed 5,000 people? Then we have to, it's actually a very, very large question that we have to look at, okay, well, what's the situation, right? You've got these disciples that themselves, they were, recognizing that they couldn't possibly feed these people all by themselves. You have people that go away without going away hungry. And then you have the author of Matthew himself. And you have the author of Mark, Luke, and John. I'm not sure which ones all record it, but you have these other sources. And you have things like these disciples who were, and I don't want to get all into this because this could go on and on and on for a very long time, but very briefly, these disciples who recorded it, we have very old manuscripts. Now, we don't have the originals, but we have very old ones that were copied more or less within a century of when they were originally written, which is very, very early and very good for them being accurate representations of what these authors wrote. Now, then you have to ask yourself, well, were these people, was Matthew making this up? Or was Mark making this up? Was it actually, or was Peter making this up? Were these people actually making it up, right? And then you have to look at the lives of these people, because people don't normally make things up. And I know I'm kind of going on. One of the key things is that people do lie, right? And that's definitely true, right? But people normally only lie if there is something to gain. And you can look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or whoever was writing these different original Gospels, or whoever was telling the stories that the Gospel writers were basing them on, these eyewitnesses, what were they gaining by this? And you can look at the original Christians and these original apostles, the original disciples. These people essentially suffered for their message, right? They didn't have to do this, right? They suffered for their message. Now, there are various different religions that have been persecuted all through the ages, and being persecuted doesn't necessarily make it true. But what's interesting about this is that this suffering occurred immediately after Jesus and concurrent with Jesus. So this suffering occurred immediately after. So it's not like it was many, many, many years later, people moved to a different place and were persecuted. No. It's the eyewitnesses themselves, right? The eyewitnesses themselves were persecuted. And not only that, many of these eyewitnesses that were persecuted, sometimes they were even given the option, right? It would be like, deny Jesus, right, and live, or deny Jesus and you won't be put to, whatever, the flames, or put in the gladiators, or be fed to wild animals, because that's what was happening to these original disciples, right? They died in a variety of ways, whether it was crucifixion or burning, or it was being fed to animals, or a whole lot of terrible, terrible ways. Sometimes they would give them an option, right? And they would say, okay, deny Jesus and live. Or something like, or say like, okay, say that this was all made up and live. And they would have benefits for denying Jesus. And they didn't deny it. They believed this story. And sure, that makes sense. Or it would make sense if they had something to gain, or it would make sense if they actually thought that these stories were true. If they actually thought that Jesus really had, if they thought that Jesus had power to save them, right? All of us nowadays, looking at COVID-19, looking at the coronavirus, a lot of us are thinking about death more often, right? And if you had death looking at you in the face and saying, okay, you might die and you have the option of doing something and living, most of us would choose the option to live, unless you thought that denying Jesus was worse than death somehow, right? And so these people clearly believed in their own message. If they thought, if this was only intended to be some kind of fairy tale for children and intended only to be a nice story, they had plenty of opportunity to deny Jesus and be like, oh, wait. I told those stories just for fun, just to sell some copies, and just because I thought it was a nice story. Or, Jesus was a great guy, but I just made up all these miracles and, I wanted to have this particular gain. No. They didn't deny Jesus. They didn't do that. And so clearly they recognize that Jesus, had some power to save them from death. And that's why they didn't deny Jesus. And that is strong evidence, right? At least they believed. They believed that Jesus had the power to save. Right? They believed. And if they believed that Jesus had the power to save, that is evidence, but doesn't prove, but is evidence for truth of these miracles. Okay? The miracles sound amazing. They sound like impossible. But we have what? We have eyewitnesses. We have very good historical records. We don't have any artifacts, at least for the most part, as far as I know. There are some artifacts of different people of the Bible, but certainly no artifacts of these miracles. We have understandable reactions of people, and we have very reliable sources because these sources had nothing to gain and they claimed that what they were saying was true. Okay, so very long story, longer than I intended, but let's go ahead and continue on with the miracles of Jesus. All right. So, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So, Jesus dismissed the people after they got food. The disciples are now going over to the other side in a boat, and Jesus is just like hanging out by himself for a little bit. So, after he dismissed the crowd, he wanted to have a little bit of alone time because people are always around Jesus. So Jesus is like, all right, I've got to get some time by myself to just relax, pray, and calm down for a bit. So he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So the disciples are going on, and Jesus is just there praying. During the fourth watch of the night, and so this is pretty far late into the night, early morning, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Well, what does that mean, walking on the lake? All right, well, we're going to get to that because it's not clear yet, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, They were terrified. So he's out now. So the boat's in the middle of the lake, and now he's also in the middle of the lake, right? Apparently walking on the water. Well, not just apparently, he must be walking on the water if he's not in some other boat. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Their response is understandable. This cannot be Jesus, because we see Jesus and we don't see a boat and we are nowhere close to land. So if he's walking on water, he can't actually be a real person, because our normal suggestions of gravity would say he would sink down into the water, right? We know that water is a liquid. We know that gravity pulls you down. And so that must be a ghost. And that was their understanding. Makes sense. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." So he's saying, I'm not a ghost. It's really me. It's really me. Okay? So we can add to our miracles walking on water. Walking on water. That's a physical impossibility, right? And it's it's impossible by scientific means, but it doesn't actually go against science. You can't say ahead of time that science would say this is impossible, because science just tells us what normally happens, and this is a special occurrence. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water. Peter's walking on the water too, and came toward Jesus. That is what faith does. Peter is now walking on the water too. Why? Because he's looking at Jesus. And Jesus said, "Come." Peter just said, "Okay, if Jesus says come, I'm going to come." And Peter himself was able to walk on the water. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. He got distracted from Jesus. There's wind, there's waves, and he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out. So this is clearly, he's now in the water, and he's now sinking, and he's about to drown, sinking in water, right? There's wind and waves and all this stuff. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith." Wow, that's tough. He just walked on water, and Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Jesus expects us to keep our eyes on Jesus. He expects us to actually believe. I know we're here discussing whether miracles can happen or not, but when you're faced with it, your normal response would be to doubt, because it's not your normal experience. But Jesus says, believe. Look at me. Believe. Faith is not merely, okay, I just believe. I believe that this miracle happened, or I believe that, Jesus rose from the dead. Faith is more than that. Faith is acting. Faith is walking. Faith is keeping your eyes on Jesus and obeying. Jesus said, "Come out," right? He said, "Come." So Peter came, he obeyed. His faith kept him on top of the water, but when he doubted, he sank. And when they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him. They worshiped him because they knew that this was an incredible miracle. They've already seen Jesus heal people, right? They've already seen him feed 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people, right? But now they worship him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God," right? And what did Jesus do? Do you say, no, I'm not the Son of God? No, he didn't contradict them. Jesus accepted that worship because that's who he is. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. So here, that's going to go on to the next story. So we see here is that this concept of faith is not merely just believing, but it's also a concept of acting on your beliefs. And that Jesus expects quite a bit of faith. And that faith itself is powerful. It's not just something that's able to comfort us, but it's powerful so that even Peter was able to walk on water. All right, continuing on. They had, when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him. Now, if you've remember from before, we may have even skipped over this, but Jesus had been there before, and he had helped out a man who was demon possessed there before. And so now, and then they sent Jesus away. But after a while, when they realized what really happened, and when they found out, okay, Jesus is actually healing people and helping people out, then they're going to bring all their sick people to him. And they begged him to let the sick touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. So these people are now all being healed. Not just a few people, but it says all who touched him were healed. All. That means everyone. Everyone that was sick was healed. That is huge. Just as big of a miracle as walking on water and feeding 5,000 people, right? All these people, no matter what their sickness was, they were healed. That is huge. Okay, one more thing before we're going to end out today. So we got about 5 more minutes. I just want to read this one story and just think about it, because this is in your homework and it's pretty cool. Excuse me. So next story. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus, and we expect Pharisees and Jesus have conflict all the time, right? And they came from Jerusalem, so it means they're probably still in Galilee. They're in northern Israel. And they asked, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Remember, tradition of the elders was something that only the Pharisees and the people that followed the Pharisees were paying attention to, right? This is part of the oral tradition, not part of the Bible, right? And so they're complaining, you're not following our oral tradition. And the reason that they came to Jesus is because in a lot of ways, Jesus' teaching was similar to the Pharisees' teaching, a lot more similar than the Sadducees, right? So Jesus replied, and why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Ooh, man, Jesus is just like cutting right to the chase here. So basically saying, okay, sure, you have these traditions which are nice, but you shouldn't disobey the Bible in keeping with your traditions, right? So some of your traditions are actually bad. They are actually contradicting the Bible. Now, some of them are good, but some of them are not. And this is what he says, for God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, hey, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is a gift devoted to God, and thereby not helping out your parents, he is not to honor his father with it. Thus, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites. Keep in mind that money very well may have been used to benefit those, church workers, temple workers, or what have you. So Jesus calls them, you hypocrites, you actors. You're just appearing to be good, but you're actually not good in your heart. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into a man's mouth does not make him. Came to him and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? Well, yeah, duh, disciples. The disciples, once again, actually they probably understood that. This is a rhetorical question. So yes, of course. He replied, he doesn't care. That's basically his reply. Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If a blind man leads a blind man, they both will fall into a pit. So he doesn't care if they offend them. He wants to teach them the truth, whether they're offended or not. Peter said, explain the parable to us. And this is what we want to actually focus on, right? Explain this parable. So Jesus once again says, are you so dull? Come on, guys. You've been with me so long. You should understand parables by now. And then he asked them, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. That is the heart of Jesus. That's what he really, really cares about. What's in the heart. So it's not about, what's in your, what you're eating, right? So Jesus is not, caring about the food that goes in there. Jesus is saying this food that goes in your mouth, that's not, you may be you're maybe eating with dirty hands, you're maybe eating dirty food, but that's not going to make you dirty. right? Now, obviously, we're in a time where it's really, really good to wash your hands with this pandemic going around, right? It could make you sick, but Jesus is saying that's not going to make you spiritually dirty. It's not going to make you truly dirty. It's not going to make you dirty in a way that really, really matters. So what matters is your heart. What's in your heart? If you have bad things in your heart, those bad things can come up from your heart and you could speak them out. Or you could act them out. And those things that you speak out, to speak out hatred, or to speak out something that's going to hurt somebody else, or to act out hatred or something like that, that is going to make you truly dirty. It's going to make you truly unclean. And that's what Jesus is talking about, right? So don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body, right? You're going to eat some food and then you're going to poop it out or pee it out, right? And you're going to use some of the energy, use some of the nutrients and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, that's it, right? But the things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. These make a man unclean. These are the things that are going to make you truly dirty. That's what God actually cares about. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Or out of the heart also comes love and good deeds and helping others out. The heart can be bad, the heart can be good, right? But when the heart is bad, these are what makes a man unclean. But eating with unwashed hands does not make him unclean, right? So he's not saying there's anything wrong with washing your hands, obviously, right? But he's saying that, maybe you'll get a, sick stomach, maybe you'll get diarrhea or something, but that's not really going to make you truly dirty. Because what matters is whether your heart is clean. What matters is whether your heart is good. And if your heart is bad, if your heart is unclean, that is going to affect everything you do and everything you say. And that's what Jesus cares about. So, all right, we're going to end there. See you, Lupita, and I have another class here in 2 minutes too. All right, we're going to end here. Bye.